Welcome back, Wise Chat. It's Monday, July 15th. I don't know if anything. I need to ask Michael what happened this weekend. He'll be on to talk about current events in just a few. Get comfy, lick the stem, and we'll be right with you.
Hey, it's Wisecrack Live. It's Monday. It's morning in America. It's Monday, July 15th. 11 days removed from the 4th of July. We had a bit of a weekend, folks. We had a bit of a weekend. I'll tell you what happened for me this weekend was on Saturday was my daughter's first birthday. We had a birthday party in the park. Found a good spot, under some shade trees. Got some breakfast tacos, a couple coolers of cold beverages. Had a really nice time. Around 3 p.m. we wrapped up. Packed up in the car, got back home, and I walked into the house with this feeling of satisfaction for having successfully thrown a children's birthday party. It seemed like everyone had fun. And thank you so much, Liberal Animator. I think I said literal. Walked inside feeling good. And the first thing I hear is, oh my God, they shot Trump. It was a weird vibe shift going from that to that, one of the that's being, of course, my daughter's birthday party. The other that being they shot the president, the vice president, future president again. He's going to be the president again, guys. Sorry to say that. So a wild weekend. We're going to talk about things related to it, but I'm glad you're getting here. People are saying things. Wow, John, that was great. Yeah, it was a wild weekend. There's stuff to talk about. And, if you came here looking for reckless political gossip, if you came here looking for, inflamed rhetoric and pontification, if you came here looking for quick takes and sound bites, if you came here looking for psychotic streamers making horrifically offensive jokes about people who died, it's not going to happen today. I did feel the timeline split though. So I'll tell you what we want to talk about today, and we can kind of ease into it. Please like the stream if you are here. Like it, love it, want some more of it. We need some numbers today. I'll say it. We had a disastrous Friday. The big tragedy for us this weekend was that Friday's video has done just ass numbers. Real bad. Good engagement. A lot of you left really cool comments. That's awesome. But no one really watched it. So, that's a thing. It helps us when the videos get watched. I'm sure you all watch them, so I'm preaching to the choir here, but it would be good to have a nice stream to make YouTube like us again a little bit. Someone asked about my daughter's birthday cake. The issue there was I didn't want her to have any. I'm that guy. I'm the guy who said, I don't think she should have sugar. I don't think we should let her have cake. And then I found out that my wife let her have more cake than I wanted her to have, and I was not happy. I wasn't happy with it. Bailey says, howdy, anything worth talking about? Homeschooling's not a hot topic, I guess. It's not a hot topic. And we've learned. So as we ease into it, excited to be here. I'm Michael Burns. I'm with producer Henry. This is Wisecrack's Case of the Mondays. This is how we start off the week, because it seems like all of us week after week in this time of pandemic, epidemic, all types of demics, are always suffering from symptoms of the Mondays. I think this Monday in particular, because it's another Monday where we're left feeling like, what the hell's happening? Last Monday we talked a bit about some of the debates happening in America around the age of Joseph Raoul Biden and concerns about his candidacy, his ability to be fit as president. There were some attempts to prove to us last week that he was young and ready. They all went, if not poorly, they were a little lukewarm. That was the huge political debate, right? We were living in crazy times because, oh my God, is a sitting president gonna have to step down during re-election? They're gonna force him out. This is the biggest thing ever, but it wasn't the biggest thing ever for long, because then the other thing happened, and I think the thing that has stood out to me the most. I'm curious what other people thought as well. The thing that stood out to me the most over the weekend, paying attention to some of the discourse, was the notion of political violence being used, and not just used by jamokes, jabronis, and bozos on the internet, but by professional political commentators, from journalists, from politicians. This notion of political violence. This was an instance of political violence. We can't have political violence. Liberal animator, thank you so much. And thank you for watching the video on Friday. But, Hungry Killer 666 just got it, as does John Kim. I'm just leaning into it, guys. I have hair everywhere except the one place where you want it. And I'm just leaning into comfort today. It's hot here. Enough's going on.
A high tea specimen.
Yeah, I'm super high tea. Eat it, Andrew Tate. You fucking clean shaved little wimp. Come to my house, Andrew Tate. I will wipe the floors with your silky smooth whale body. But where are we going with this? But so there was a lot of discussion of political violence, and I think that people are using that word wrong. It makes me think of the line from Inigo Montoya in what is it? The Princess Bride. Yeah, the famous to Wallace Shawn's character. I don't think that word means what you think it means, and that's what we saw a lot of over the weekend. People using a word to imply that it means something that it doesn't mean. So we'll kind of start. Here I'm going to do something. I'm going to do something crazy right now. Let's see. I'm going to send Henry a link, and I'm going to do something because I think this is our destiny, Henry. I think it's our destiny to look at a little bit of Wikipedia right now. We're destined to do this. So I sent you a link. Let's just look at the Wikipedia definition of political violence, okay? Because the way in which this term got used, and we're going to look at some scholarly stuff too. We're destined to do this, but we'll break from our destiny in a little bit and talk about some scholars and some actual writings on these things. But great. So people have been using the term political violence to talk about an assassination attempt on a president. Now, was it an attempt of violence against a politician? Yes. Was it political violence? No. Now you might be saying, Michael, are you parsing words here? Of course it was political violence. Someone tried to shoot a politician. Well, political violence means something very different than this. And I posted about this on my personal Twitter account over the weekend. But there's a lot of political violence happening in the world right now. There's political violence that is backed by the United States happening right now. Political violence carried out by, law enforcement backed by the state. One could even argue that, we have economic policies in the United States, at least, that could be considered forms of political violence. We could argue that, recent Supreme Court rulings border on political violence. But I don't think that what happened this weekend is political violence, and that's not to downplay it. If you're looking for me to say something glib, I'll say this, it's like not good or cool. I'm not going to make jokes about what happened. I don't think it was funny or rad or anything like that. I think that you know, yeah, it's and like I don't know. I'm not gonna be out here being like glib about the fact that people got like killed because they like a politician that I don't like. You know, we talk about empathy a lot here when we talk about what our political values or principles would be, and you know, one of them is a sort of generalized empathy, meaning that I don't know, man. Just because a guy in Pennsylvania uh, likes Donald Trump doesn't mean that I think it's like cool or funny or whatever that he died. I don't think that. You know, so I just want to say that at the outset that just because something isn't political violence doesn't mean it doesn't have horrific stakes. But I think it's important to understand the distinction, to understand what's happening now, and to understand how the rhetoric around what's happening now can become and maybe is becoming kind of dangerous. So let's look at ye olde Wikipedia. And let's be honest, Wikipedia is a great resource. I'm glad that it exists. So the political violence is violence which is perpetrated in order to achieve political goals. Now, you might even say to yourself, yeah, it wasn't a political goal that this dude wanted to shoot Trump so he couldn't be president. I wouldn't say that's necessarily the case. It can include violence which is used by a state against other states, war, you know, Gaza, violence which is used by a state against civilians and non-state actors, forced disappearance, psychological warfare, police brutality, targeted assassination. So when we think about political violence and assassinations, like if a U.S.-backed force tries to assassinate a leader in like Nicaragua or Haiti or something, that would be a version of political violence that involves an attempted assassination, torture, ethnic cleansing, or genocide, right? Now, I just want to note that some of the examples used of political violence are war of a state against another state, violence used by a state against civilians, you know, torture, ethnic cleansing, genocide, and then violence used by non-state actors against states and civilians, kidnappings, targeted assassinations, guerrilla warfare. So here's what I'd say: a lot of political violence is happening right now in the world. A lot of political violence is happening in a way that's backed by America right now, but no one's talked about it. You know, a lot of politicians, I at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, friends, I have not heard a lot of politicians refer to some things that are happening right now as political violence. But then we make this. Oh, what's up, Leaf from Denmark? Sorry, I just get excited when Danes come here. Hi. And when you leave, I'll say hi. So just paying attention to some of that right now. It's weird to me that what happened on Saturday has opened up a discourse about political violence, yet years of state-backed violence, overseas violence, genocide, police violence, all of these things have not been discussed in the mainstream political discourse in America as political violence. Of course, activists and scholars and theorists have talked about things these ways. You know, yeah. So I think that it's, you know, important to note that definition a little bit. Going down a chunk, it says, due to the imbalance of power which exists between state and non-state actors, political violence often takes the form of asymmetric warfare, where neither side is able to directly assault the other, instead of relying on tactics such as guerrilla warfare and terrorism. It can often include attacks on civilian or otherwise non-combatant targets. Let's see. Yeah, so if you want to, like, you know, look into this more, you can, but there's a lot of examples, at least in the Wikipedia thing, about political violence, and I will say that what you don't have are examples like what happened over the weekend. So so we'll just kind of start with that. Hopefully everyone's doing okay. It's, you know, getting cooking a little bit here today. It's Wisecrack. Case of the Mondays. Glad to see you all here. We're getting a little into it today. We're talking about political violence. And what's up, Aladdin? Hungry Killer says Denmark is 1, America is 26, and political violence. So let's maybe we have some videos pulled up. Maybe we'll start with some video stuff and we'll get into some reading. But our goal today is to walk away feeling like we all have a better understanding of what political violence is so that we can adequately understand the stakes of what are happening now and try to avoid falling down some rabbit holes. If you have longer thoughts or questions about any of this, please do hit us up at wisecracklive666@gmail.com. That's wisecracklive666@gmail.com. We do check those emails. And before we really get cooking, this is going to be a seamless transition. Guys, we have a partner for the stream. It's our coffee partner. They're called Yes Please. I know some people have gotten it recently. Someone over on the Discord was describing using this exact roast. It's their Homestar Espresso. Here's the deal. Yes Please Coffee. They don't pay us to do this. They're a local coffee roaster from here in Southern California. A very cool team, small team. They're independent. They treat their workers right. They really care about what they do, and they partner with us. And if you order and use the code Wisecrack, there's a link in the description. You can go to their website. You get 20% off your first bag. You get a cool little zine when you subscribe to their stuff. A little playlist. I'll show you the QR code if you want to check it out. You can kind of just pause and scan. But when you get your coffee, you get this little thing, and it'll be like, hey, let me tell you about the coffee. Here's how you make it. Here's what you do. All this stuff. I like things like that. Okay. I miss the era of zines and handmade posters for shows and stuff. But if you are a coffee person and you want to support what we're doing, check out Yes Please Coffee. And you know who liked coffee? Hannah Arendt liked coffee, I think. So maybe we'll start with Arendt. So what I want to do is look at, and guys, there's a lot of philosophers and political theorists who have discussed violence in a pretty serious way over the years. So we'll start with Arendt, and then we'll go on to looking at one of my favorite theorists and philosophers, Frantz Fanon. If you guys have theorists who you think get at questions of violence in interesting ways, please do let us know. I think we missed 666, so I'm sorry for that. Wisecrack Live 666.
Wow, we just shot right past it. Actually, yeah, we're at 692.
Oh, but then for me it just dropped hard. Oh, it's just dropping like flies now. What did we do? Like the stream if you're here, guys. It helps us out a lot. Really appreciate it. So let's start with this video. And I'll be honest, I've watched this guy's channel before, and it's pretty solid. I haven't watched this particular video, so maybe we'll tap out.
Hello, friends. Today we're going
to after the last video we watched together, the Hassan Minaj thing. I'm scared to watch more videos on here. But this is it's like the Great Books channel. I forget the guy's name. Great Books Professor. What is it? Yeah, Great Books Prof. Pretty cool channel. Guy breaks down a lot of really interesting books. I recommend checking it out if you like videos where dudes talk about books. So we're just talking about Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt, a German philosopher and political theorist, a student of Heidegger at one point, but notably not a Nazi, wrote a lot about the state and violence and power, and a lot of her thinking is shaped by living through World War II and theorizing in its aftermath. So let's start this and check it out. And the point here is to learn about violence from a philosophical and political perspective to accurately understand what that concept means. So when we see the dorks on MSNBC, Fox News, or whatever just start throwing words around, we can say, nah, dog, that's not it. A guy with hairy shoulders told me that it means something different. So let's start this video.
to talk about Hannah Arendt's On Violence. On Violence is actually one of Arendt's lesser known works, but to my mind, it's actually quite an important book. So in this video, we're going to talk about the differences between power and violence. We're going to talk about Arendt's analysis of the history of political thought, where she gets her definition of power, and
I do see someone brought up Arendt being problematic. Yeah, just note too, I'm not the biggest Arendt head, but she's an interesting theorist on this. It's crazy. A bunch of people just came here and left immediately. I hope we didn't hurt
also
them.
going to talk about how technology might change the nature of violence in a political context. For my money, the most startling claim that Arendt makes in this work is that power and violence are opposites. It's pretty conventional for us in public discourse and even...
Oh, I'm getting confused. Is something like happening in the chat? Sorry.
I'm trying to monitor that. I'm also wondering if we had some kind of connection thing. We've had a strong connection, but yeah, the viewer stuff and something YouTube's. I'll tell you more on the chat.
Yeah. Sorry, I just got so confused, guys. Sorry, I want to get in this video. I looked down and like the numbers are going crazy, and I saw someone said unsubbing, and they flicked us off. If we don't have Moni Ova, we're Ova. We're Ova without Moni Ova. I do have hairy legs like Corn Pop. I have those legs just like Corn Pop. Okay, let's watch this. And again, we're not here to debate the validity of Arendt, but to get into some of her
in political theory, to conflate power and violence, to assume that violence is a form of power. When we talk about the most powerful nations in the world, if we're not talking about their economic might, we are certainly talking about their military might. We equate a nation's power with its capacity for violence.
And I think this is important to note with a lot of discussions happening now about how like America isn't about violence. We don't do violence. Power isn't grounded in violence. We vote at the ballot box, or as Biden calls it, the battle box. This narrative that's been pushed on us all weekend, trying to detach the political edifice of the United States of America from violence, it feels almost parodic, if I'm using that word correctly here, because so much of what a nation state is in general is the capacity for violence. And the United States of America in particular is one of the most, one of the largest, I guess, how do I want to put this? One of the most organized and powerful structures for the administration of violence in the history of humanity, is what our country is. If you think about the capacity of political violence, police violence, state violence, economic violence, I mean, violence is at the heart of the whole thing. Violence is at the heart of the state. Think about how states get established. We all went to school, whether it was homeschool, online school, some sort of school. What do we learn about in history? It's just like the history of groups of people using violence to will power over other groups of people. It's not like states get established because people are like, hey, so we'll take this zone and you guys just take that. You're cool with that? Awesome. This is great. I'm glad we could just work this out like friends. This is great. No, we'll keep going.
So one of the extraordinary things about violence, Arendt says, is that there's actually widespread consensus on what violence is. She says there exists a consensus among political theorists from left to right to the effect that violence is nothing more than the most flagrant manifestation of power. So that is to say, we typically think of violence as the extreme end of power, or the final manifestation of power. And this idea that violence is the extreme form of power, Arendt says we can find that rooted in the history of political thought. She says, at least within the history of Western thought, there is a tradition that equates political power with command or domination. And if we understand political...
Yeah, and I think like one could say, oh, well, that used to be the case, but now it's economic power. It's not, violent domination. It's not domination by force, but you could still look at the ways in which wielding economic power do the same thing, because there's a type of violence that happens via economics, because we could say that, creating unequal distribution of resources, wealth, and power. We could say that the global north exploiting the global south, all of these things involve levels of violence. We know historically, too, violence has been used to sort of keep the global south in the position that the global north wants it to be in. But we'll learn about this more when we read and watch some stuff with Frantz, Fanon.
Political power in this way, it makes a certain degree of sense that violence would be one of the modes in which this power is exercised. However, Arendt argues there is another thread within the history of political thought, an alternative tradition. And within this tradition, we can find an alternative articulation of the relationship between violence and power. And I think Arendt would say it's a more accurate account of that relationship. And she claims we can find this alternative account in the democratic tradition, or maybe the republican tradition. As she often does, Arendt takes us back to ancient Athens. And she says what we can find in the birthplace of democracy is an image of political power as a collective enterprise.
And, we think about Athens too. I've talked a lot recently on streams and in videos about Plato and Aristotle in particular. These are the people that are kind of articulating an early democratic political philosophy, especially Aristotle.
And she connects this to Republican Rome as well. She sees that as another model. What she finds in these regimes is a kind of political power that is contingent upon people's participation. And Arendt believes we can learn from these examples something about...
And I think it's interesting that in Biden's remarks yesterday, that was his kind of pitch, right? Like, we don't do violence. We participate. We vote. We go to quote directly, the battle box. but it's almost like we're given the narrative that what we exist in is a form of like Athenian participatory democracy, when in fact it seems to be the case that we might live in more of a coercive and power dominated system grounded in the looming threat of violence.
But the nature of politics and political power itself. All political institutions are manifestations and materializations of power. They petrify and decay as soon as the living power of the people ceases to uphold them. So the picture Arendt paints here is fascinating and I think persuasive. She claims that all political institutions, whether we're talking about a Senate or a president or a court, all of these institutions and offices derive their power from the support of the people. And insofar as people no longer support or believe in or respect the authority of particular political institutions, they calcify, they decay, they lose their power. So Arendt effectively gives us two theories of government here. On the one hand, there's government by power. And that's really government from the bottom up.
Did the watch together go out for you?
Rule. And they use their power. They invest their power in an institution or even
accidentally
an individual
closed that tab.
Governs.
So let me go back. Hopefully
the alternative is a top-down situation where one individual or maybe...
Oh no, did it start over on the stream as well?
I was pausing it and it kept going. Are you back in the room?
Well, yeah, I'm in the room now. What timestamp is it at for you? Sorry, friends.
It reset to 0 for me.
Okay, I'm just going to start at 3 minutes. Sorry about that.
Of the people. And insofar as people no longer support or believe in or respect the authority of particular political institutions, they calcify, they decay, they lose.
I wish that was true. Maybe.
Their power. So Arendt effectively gives us two theories of government here.
I just want to stop and look at this for a second. Okay, so we have government by power. I mean, and again, this is the idea. We see this in Athenian democracy. You see this in someone like a Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who talks about power operating at the level of the will of the people. And if you were going to compare this to, a like Hobbes and Rousseau, someone like Hobbes or Locke, for them, the sovereign power is an institution or an individual. People sacrifice something of themselves so that the sovereign protects them or creates a society they want to live in. For Rousseau, the sovereign is the people. The will of the people is the ultimate power. So you see that government by power thing right there. And then, of course, government by violence. And I don't know. I think that I'm curious, based on where you live, let us know in the chat if you think you live in a government of power or violence. You could type in the word power or violence or just P or V. Although if you just type in P or V and someone checks in the chat, they might think that we're doing something very weird. So maybe type in power or violence. We could also run a poll, but let's keep going. But I think it's interesting to think about these two things. And I think we always have to remember, just because we are told we live in one, doesn't mean we do.
On the one hand, there's government by power. And that's really government from the bottom up, in a sense. The many rule. And they use their power. They invest their power in an institution or even an individual who then governs. The alternative is government by violence. And that's really more of a top-down situation where one individual or maybe a few rule over the many. And they use violence as an instrument to enforce obedience or maybe order amongst the people. Now, I think what we see here is Arendt actually modifying and building upon the whole social
and I do just want to say a big point of rhetoric in American political life is law and order. You hear politicians on all sides talk about the importance of law and order. And it's hard to have a political system that's so grounded in a fetishization of law and order and then trying to act as if that's a system that's primarily grounded in the power of people.
Contract tradition. If you've read Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau,
I didn't mean to say this before he got
some
there.
Version of this model sounds pretty familiar. Groups of people getting together.
Oh, wait. I want to look at one thing real quick. See if I can rewind it so I get it there. Fuck, marry, kill, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. I'm going to say kill Hobbes.
Agreed there.
Oh, man.
I think you have to fuck Rousseau and marry Locke, or at least that's what I'm doing.
I think so. I guess that's it. You could also let us know what you think of the
So
chat.
some version of this model sounds pretty familiar. Groups of people getting together, deciding collectively to be governed by a particular institution or person or office. Arendt seems to have something like this model in mind. But I would say there's something also of the Machiavellian tradition in Arendt's formulation. Machiavelli, even in The Prince, which is arguably, a pretty tyrannical book, seems to recognize that a prince cannot govern without the support of the people. In The Prince, there's a couple passages in chapter 9 that I think are worthy of note here.
I'll be honest. I've never like read Machiavelli. I've read excerpts of Machiavelli.
Same.
I've never read The Prince. Never sat down with that book.
Machiavelli says, furthermore, a prince can never secure himself against a hostile people, as they are too many. Against the great, he can secure himself, as they are few. And he goes on to say, also, the prince always lives of necessity with the same people. But he can well do without the same great persons, since he can make and unmake them every day, and take away and give them reputation at his convenience. And lastly, but when a prince who founds on the people knows how to command, and is a man full of heart, and with his spirit and his orders keeps the generality of people inspired, he will never find himself deceived by them, and he will see he has laid his foundations well.
Is Trump kind of doing a sort of like dark Machiavellianism?
I don't even know if it's like dark. I mean,
yeah, maybe he just is.
Because the Prince you see on those like motivational, like 20 books to read before 25, kind of like hustle culture, like shortlist all the time. So like they're explicitly doing it, I think, more so than like trying to like deceitfully approach it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the reaction to everything that happened over the weekend, and I don't know, some of the imagery, it seems in line with that. Okay, let's keep going.
So I think Arendt is correct that we can find this way of thinking about political power within the history of political thought. We don't have to think about political power in terms of command and obedience, master-slave relationships. So Arendt redefines power as something very specific. Power corresponds to the human ability not just to act, but to act in concert. Power is never the property of an individual. It belongs to a group, and remains in existence only so long as the group keeps together. When we say of somebody that he is in power, we actually refer to as being empowered by a certain number of people to act in their name.
And, this is something we see a lot in, political theory and philosophy, post-World War II, back half of the 20th century. This notion that there is power in a collective sense when people organize around ideas and causes, when we think about subjectivity, not as an individual enterprise or not as us being subjects of the state, subjects of the queen, but us being subject together in sort of collective operations. But then you look at this contrast, right? A bunch of theorists and even political movements grounded in the idea of power being a collective enterprise. But then an ideology, namely neoliberalism and sort of Western democracy, that emphasizes individualism above all else. And there's a sneaky trick there that individualism feels empowering to us. Individual freedom feels great. I'm an individual. I have freedom. I choose. But what do I choose? I choose to participate in the market. I become a subject to the market and a subject to a certain economic system as an individual. And while I might, let's say, gain consumer economic identity power as an individual, I lose political power because my political activities are reduced to I, as an individual, can donate some money to a cause. I, as an individual, can vote. Maybe I, as an individual, go protest with some other people. So we see that. And we also see how it's easier to inflict violence against individuals than groups, and how the state in particular makes a game of that. So
according to Arendt's definition of power, there is no such thing as a powerful person. There is only a person who has been invested with power by a group of people. Both power and violence can be used to achieve political goals. In that way, they're alike. But through power, we use speech to reach agreement amongst people, and the majority rule to enforce consensus. Now, I think there is an interesting question about tyranny of the majority. What does that look like? Is that an exercise of power? Does that count as an unjust
I mean, a way that Rousseau thinks about this, which I think is interesting, this is a little bit of a sidetrack, but while we're here, you might as well. Rousseau would talk about the difference between the individual will and the collective will. So maybe I want one thing, but the will of the people wants another thing. And I recognize that maybe the thing that is best for me is not what's best for everyone. And I subordinate my individual desire to the collective desire. But Americans especially, we're really bad.
Exercise of power, something to think about.
Again, because it's all about our individual power.
Now, violence allows a small number of people to compel submission, and a minority are able to rule and enforce obedience. So think about a ruling elite. And it's perhaps this most of all, that small groups of people use violence in opposition to the power of larger groups. That gives Arendt her sense that the two are opposites. At the very end of part 2, Arendt tells us power and violence are opposites. Where the one rules absolutely, the other is absent. Violence appears where power is in jeopardy. But left to its own course, it ends in power's.
I mean, I wonder too if you could argue, and this is me just throwing some shit at the wall, guys. So if this is a bad argument, that's fine. I'll accept that. But I wonder if one of the reasons like violence, and I wouldn't say political violence, but violence related to the political is becoming more common in American political life is the vacuum of any sense of collective power, that because there isn't really a sense that we have any power, and then there's even a sense that the people who are supposed to have power don't have power, and it creates these spaces for almost like a nihilistic violence in the lack of anything resembling consistent or coherent power, or something that makes us feel like we have a level of power.
Disappearance. This implies that it is not correct to think of the opposite of violence as nonviolence. To speak of nonviolent power is actually redundant. Violence can destroy power. It is utterly incapable of creating it. Now, this is an extraordinary position, and maybe something radically new in the history of political thought. Because again, as Arendt
This guy has great hair.
says, we typically think of violence as the final arbiter in political disagreements. So we think of government flexing its military muscle or using police force as a demonstration, a manifestation of its power. But Arendt says we need to think about things from the other way around. What we're actually seeing when we see police in riot gear or when we see a military intervention, Arendt argues, is a loss of power. The state is using violence.
And I do think what he's saying vis-a-vis Arendt there is important. Again, like kind of related to what I was saying before. That violence we see, and think about, police violence against protest or something like that. It almost exhibits weakness and not power. It exhibits a type of fragility rather than control by a bunch of DEI-loving liberal arts grads protesting with witty signs.
Violence to desperately cling to power that is in jeopardy. When we think of something like a large-scale riot, what we're seeing is people withdrawing their support from the power structure. And in response to this loss of power, states sometimes use violence in order to achieve order and obedience. At one point, Arendt puts this quite clearly. She says, the loss of power creates a temptation to substitute violence for power.
I do think that quote seems super apt for understanding the types of politically related violence we're seeing in America these days. The loss of power becoming a temptation to substitute violence for power. Because you could even have that sense of like, what does one do if they want to participate in power? What does one do to get power? And then what happens if you feel completely impotent to have a sort of power?
So when state flexes,
I mean, it's almost like political incel logic. I could say more about that later, but I think you get what I mean.
Muscle, Arendt says, power is in jeopardy. Now, I want to say a word about technology before we close, and about new forms of weapons and how that might change.
Okay, I'm going to stop there for now. I see in the chat, John Ford said, look up Erica Chenoweth, Why Civil Resistance Works, and Civil Resistance, what everyone needs to know. Violence, conversion, map movement, single power. Sorry that YouTube is censoring you, John. We'll definitely check that out. Is Erica Chenoweth related to Kristen Chenoweth? I feel like I've heard about this text before, but I want to look it up. And John, I'm going to try to remember. If you have it in you, to email us at wisecracklive666 at gmail.com. We'll also hit it up that way. Omnipotent Lenny said violence can't be power. What? So Lenny, if you're just tuning in, I think the gist here is is that we might think of violence as power, but violence is an attempt to hold on to power when power is fading. Actual power is built through a consensus of people. So force isn't power, violence isn't power, at least according to Arendt. If you're just tuning in, this is Wisecrack Live. It's Monday. Well, it's Wisecrack Live, but it's Wisecrack's Case of the Mondays, you know? It's a subspecies of our main show. I'm Michael Burns. I'm here with producer Henry, and we are trying to understand the concept of political violence in light of the weekend. We asked people in a poll if the nation that they live in operates more in terms of violence or power. We're 51% V and 48% P. Thank you so much for liking the stream. Please keep doing so. I want to shift now to talking about Frantz Fanon. David Lego Hands in the chat said, could violence be the expression of power having failed? I think absolutely. I think that's like the point here. I mean, think about it this way. Think about it from like a parenting perspective. As I mentioned, it was my daughter's first birthday on Saturday. That was the most important event in America on Saturday. Anyone who tried to take shine away from my daughter's birthday, how dare you? How dare you, mainstream news media? But like, think about when a parent, you know, yells at or, God forbid, uses physical force on a child. Is that an exhibition of power? Well, no, it's normally a sign of a loss of power. Or a teacher screaming at a class, or like my seventh grade science teacher, Miss Johnston, she threw a 3-hole punch across the room during class. Real thing that happened. When Miss Johnston did that, it wasn't her exhibiting power. It was her using a sign of violence in light of the fragility of her power in the classroom. When a parent screams at their child, it's because they feel an absolute lack of power over influencing or controlling the behavior of that child. You know, the weekend did nothing. He was in his house of balloons, chilling. Okay, so let's take a look at Frantz Fanon. There's a video. It's a shorty from 3 Minute Thought on Flickr Theory. A couple of channels I haven't really checked out before today, so I'm very much enjoying both of you. Let's see what this one does. Although it says 3 Minute Thought and the video is 4 minutes and 14 seconds, so they are liars. Frantz Fanon. Well, we'll watch the video. We'll talk about it more.
On Violence is the first section of the 1961 book written by Frantz Fanon called The Wretched of the Earth.
Good book, and as you notice on the cover, prefaced by Jean-Paul Sartre.
In this section, Fanon undertakes to analyze the specificities of violence within the context of decolonization. He tries to answer the following question: what are
and just real quick, decolonization, in case that's a new word for you. Colonization, when normally a powerful Western nation takes over another nation, colonizes it, imposes its culture and its rule of law on it. Decolonization is the process of a people fighting against colonial powers and reestablishing their own state autonomy.
the negative and positive aspects of violence? Fanon himself was born and raised as a colonial subject under the rule of France in the archipelago of Antilles. His relationship with the powers of colonization is therefore acutely felt and extremely personal. Fanon describes decolonization as a historical process where two contradicting powers meet each other face to face, the colonizer and the colonized. The colonizer.
And I'll say this as well, if you were not feeling Arendt's take on violence, we're considering Fanon not because he thinks the same thing, because he has a differing perspective.
For Fanon is the one who brings violence in the home and into the mind of the native. In fact, Fanon...
I'm forgetting the name of the rapper now. Someone will know in the chat. Who had the song that has the chorus, "Don't start no shit, won't be no shit"? It's really gonna bother me now. I know it's like a southern rapper, but I sometimes, and someone in the chat, let me know. What's it say? You don't start no shit, won't be no shit. Is that Little John? Is that a Little John chorus? It very well could be, but I often think about the way Fanon talks about colonial violence in this instance of the little graphic of the, colonizer with their bat or whatever. It makes me think of that sometimes, because I feel like sometimes we'll see what this video says, but Fanon gets at the idea that that violence sometimes, when we blame violence or we try to act like colonized subjects trying to decolonize or being violent. It's really like the don't start no shit, won't be no shit principle.
Thinks that violence is the defining characteristic or the natural
T-Pain?
state
Yeah,
of
like
the
the stream,
colonial
please.
rule. Such violence is not always physical. It often manifests itself as a form of cultural discrimination or outright dehumanization of the native subject. The very psyche of the colonized subject is successfully fabricated by the colonizer who tries to shape an animal out of the colonizer.
And in a sense, like when we talk about political violence, like this is political violence. You know, it's a type of psychological warfare in which a colonial power or an oppressive power tries to shift the psychology and the internal subjectivity of the colonized individual. I mean, that's some friggin' violence.
Correspondingly, when the colonized subject is rendered non-human, colonizers are left, in their effort to control the non-human, with a single option: constant physical violence. For Fanon, therefore, the process of decolonization really is about the creation of new men. Through active participation in decolonization,
Jobo,
Native people
appreciate
can
it.
bring about a new generation of men with a new language and a new humanity. But how does violence fit in?
We talked about this in a video. I think we made a video called Who Gets to Be Human or something like that. Maybe I'll go find it and link it before we end. And I talk a lot about Fanon in that one. So if you are interested in this, we made a video
Into
on it.
all of this?
See if I
As
can
we
find it.
mentioned, violence is the natural state of the colonizer's rule. Therefore, in order to liberate themselves, native people have to find an outlet through which the forces accumulated in the forms of colonizers' aggression can be released. This is what Fanon calls the collective catharsis, which describes native people's experience of violently obliterating the colonial rule. By virtue of this decolonizing violence, the colonized subject can reclaim the new
If someone's just tuning in, and again, we're talking about political violence. We're trying to understand what it really is in light of how it's been talked about over the weekend.
generation
We're currently watching a little summary video of Frantz Fanon. That's almost
of
over.
men, a new language, and a new humanity. The humanity that once had been denied to the colonized subject can be regained, according to Fanon, by engaging in revolution. Fanon says, violence frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his
self-respect. So I think there's an important distinction here. When Arendt was talking about violence, and when Arendt was talking about violence as being not equal to power. If you're just tuning in, before this we talked about Hannah Arendt's theory of violence via a video from the Great Books Prof. You can rewind or check it out later. We always have our VODs up. But that was the type of violence that Arendt was talking about. Now, Fanon's doing something different. Fanon is talking about violence in the context of colonized or native people trying to free themselves from colonization and oppression. So, Fanon is saying, in a sense, that violence can be a mechanism of regaining power and humanity. However, he makes very clear that it is only when it is a violence being used as a means of liberating a group of individuals from violent oppression. Thus, I think, Lil Jon thing, don't start no shit, won't be no shit. He's basically saying that like the violence that happens in this case is the second part of the don't start no shit thing. Hold on. I gotta find the song. Okay, it is Lil Jon featuring
Damn,
writers.
Right?
Yeah, no, okay. This is a confusing one. I shouldn't be getting sidetracked by Lil Jon right here, guys, and I apologize for that. If you're again, please like the stream. Someone said, "Is this a right-wing channel?" Yeah, I don't. Yeah. I would love to know what I have said since that person's been here that would lead them to thinking this is a right-wing channel. It's an apolitical channel. But so the important instance here is that Fanon describes political violence, but note that political violence in this sense, in this way that he does say is positive, is something that, he says, frees the native from his inferiority complex, from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his self-respect. It's almost a process of rehumanization. Now, if you are saying or thinking to yourself, like, oh, Michael, this sounds kind of sus. Violence is always bad, right? You could consider something like the Haitian Revolution, led by Toussaint Louverture. Now, in the Haitian Revolution, you have an enslaved people liberating themselves from slavery. If you ever wondered, by the way, if you don't know the history of this, why Haiti has had so many issues, it's because they liberated themselves from slavery, and then France has made them pay for it for like 200 years. That's a real thing. Think about Harper's Ferry, John Brown. If you're thinking about American history, instances of enslaved people attempting to self-liberate via violence. Is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. You decide. Let us know in the chat. And then Fanon during his time was around and a part of Algeria's struggle for liberation from the French. So, let's watch a little bit more.
Self-respect. Most importantly, by engaging in liberation, the colonized subject discovers that his life, his breathing, and his heartbeats are the same as the colonists. The colonized subject discovers that the skin of a colonist is not worth more than the natives. Fanon clarifies, however, that violence can never be pursued without a clear political goal. Violence, which may bring about liberation, also leaves behind untreatable physical and mental problems. Revolutionary violence.
And the mental problem, I think important to note that Fanon was a psychiatrist, so he was really interested in basically like the literal psychic violence of colonization and the way in which colonial subjects are. We think obviously there's famous images that are all very disturbing of enslaved people having physical violence inflicted on them. But Fanon got at the way in which the psychic structures of oppressed and enslaved people can be damaged in these systems.
May in fact leave native people rootless and stateless. Fanon is determined to describe violence as equally harmful to both the colonizer and the colonized.
And this is important too. When he talks about violence being equally harmful, he's not just saying that this tradition of oppressive political violence hurts the oppressed subject. It also dehumanizes the colonizer, because you are losing your humanity when you are participating in a type of violence that dehumanizes others. You can't treat humans like animals without that yourself. And I think the same way, like, I'm going to sound a little pious for a second. So plug your ears for 30 seconds if you do not want the piety.
Take us to 777.
Okay, let's get 777 with some piety, guys. I think that sometimes there's certain things we want to make jokes about and we think are funny to talk about in our little like comedic nihilistic way. And I am guilty of this before you scroll through all my tweets and say like, but you've done this. I've definitely done this. But sometimes, and I was just thinking about this in the way that some people have been kind of glib about people who have like the literally people got shot at the rally on Saturday, almost with this logic of like, oh, they're just MAGA chuds, so who cares? It's like, I don't know. If we start just saying like, it's no big deal when someone who was just like hanging out gets shot and dies, what are we doing to our humanity when we start to think about people in that way? Note that I'm talking in this instance about people who are at the thing. I'm being specific with the language I'm using right here, but I think there's a risk sometimes in this stuff, and I think some of the commentary I've seen over the weekend, much of which I thought was funny or edgy or whatever, it makes you kind of wonder. That was my piety. Now I'm going to be unpious again.
There is no reason why the violence that destroyed the indigenous fabric should not result in vindication and appropriation of such violence when the colonized finally swarm into the forbidden cities.
Okay, so that's a solid video. I think it helps us get at the gist of what Fanon is doing. Maybe I'll pull up. There's this article on Fanon and the person. We only got a little bit of time left. Well, I'll pull this up. So again, if you're tuning in now, thanks for being here. Whew. Yes, stand your ground. Oh boy. Chris Maverick, you can say violence. And I hope everyone knows too. So Thomas says, sounds like he's copying Hegel's master slave dialect. He's not copying it. He read Hegel. He read Marx. He's very familiar with all this sort of stuff. He was applying it in a different context. So I think that one could argue that Fanon is Hegelian methodologically. He's definitely, in a sense, Marxist methodologically, but he's doing some stuff with the psychoanalytic approach as well. So there you go. These YouTube channels. The one was the 3-minute analysis, and one was Great Books Prof. But what we're doing right now, again, long and pork, you're never late. When you're here, you're on time, and when you're here, your family, and when you're here, welcome to the Outback. And shout out to any of our Australian friends who watch this after the fact. I know we air at a time that is damaging for our Australian brethren. But hey, we're talking about political violence. And the reason we're talking about it is because there was an act of violence over the weekend. We know what happened. Someone tried to shoot a presidential candidate. The media has been speaking about this as political violence. The president, other politicians are using this as a call to end political violence. And while we have no interest in saying that anything that happened is like good or whatever, what we are trying to say is it is potentially dangerous when the language of political violence gets used like this, because political violence is everywhere, and this is not it. There's many examples of political violence in our society, so we just want to understand concepts. Carl is a guy that has poppers. He's fun to party with, but sometimes he takes it too far. I'm going to confess something. I don't really get what poppers are, and don't teach me. I don't want to know.
Like jalapeno poppers?
No, aren't poppers a thing that I'm going to whisper this. I'm going to whisper this because there's a child sleeping. Aren't they like things that make people's, like their buttholes open up more? Is that what a popper is? Like you do it and like it relaxes your butthole.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yes, someone confirm this in the chat? Does a popper, not a jalapeno popper, does the popper, you somehow use it and it relaxes your butthole or your sphincter? Okay, so that was the important stuff. If you're just tuning in, okay, there you go. We have been talking about the nature of political violence. It's an important thing to understand, and I think often political violence can be misused in a way that can be kind of manipulative. So let's look at this article. This is from the Critical Legal Thinking website. Starts with a quote: "Decolonization is the veritable creation of a new man, or of new men, but this creation owes nothing of its legitimacy to any supernatural power. The thing which has been colonized becomes man during the same process by which it frees itself," related to what we were just talking about. And they made a documentary, I think it's called Concerning Violence, that the singer Lauryn Hill actually narrates. I'm 90% sure. If you want to look that up, I don't think it's on YouTube, but you can find it another place. But yeah, there's a Fanon documentary. This article says, Frantz Fanon's approach to violence and its effects on the individual is uniquely guided by his lived experience. He was born and raised as a colonial subject. He undertook medical school and psychiatric training. Blah, blah, blah. His most famous and controversial remarks are those around the cathartic and self-actualizing effect that violence can have on a colonial subject. However, these are often taken out of context because Fanon is certainly not an advocate of gratuitous violence. In this brief paper out on the Fanonian approach, the effects of violence on the individual, both negative and positive. And I'm going to toss a link to this into the chat so you can check this out later. We'll try to remember to put one in the description as well. But just in case anyone wants to flag this to check out later on their own. But I think the risk, right, is if we say, so there's two problems here. One problem is calling something that's not political violence, because then we're not understanding what actually happened. And we're mischaracterizing a real concept that's had massive importance in world history. And the other thing is when people say, we condone political violence. All political violence is bad. I mean, saying that a U.S. president or a U.S. presidential candidate or a U.S. senator or congressperson saying we condone political violence, all political violence is bad, is like Ronald McDonald saying all cholesterol is bad or something like that. It's
no
Monday.
more hamburgers.
Yeah, it's just like, but that is what your house is built upon, sir. You know, it's like if Truett Cathy, CEO of Chick-fil-A, is like, we condone fried chicken breast sandwiches. It's like, but that's why you have your fancy house, sir, because of the fried chicken sandwiches. I mean, America is a project built on top of like, you know, those, what's the thing, like the French cake, like the mille foie. I know I'm saying it wrong. It's like the 1,000-layer cake. Maybe one of our French correspondents is in the chat. America is like a 1,000-layer cake of political violence. There's all these layers of political violence. So to act as if we're not related to those is really dangerous. The other thing that's dangerous is then we kind of do this weird thing where America, a colonial empire, a country that's established itself on the backs of other people, that's used violence in expansion, it's used violence in the acquisition of resources, it's used violence in the clamping down of dissent. The FBI tried to kill MLK, things of that nature. When we then say all political violence is bad, then how would we react to, let's say, a colonized people engaging in an act of self-liberation? Well, that's political violence, right? Even if it's political violence against a system that imposed oppressive violence on those people. So what Fanon is doing is noting, and it's important to note as well, that in the wake of World War II, a lot of political philosophy was very much like, yo, maybe violence is just bad and we should stay away from it because it always ends badly. So here's a quote that Fanon uses about violence. He says, decolonization is the meeting of two forces opposed to each other by their very nature. Their first encounter was marked by violence, and their existence together, that is to say, the exploitation of the native by the settler, was carried on by dint of a great array of bayonets and cannons. So it's kind of saying, like, if a power establishes rule through violence, through repression, then, look at what Fanon says. He says he emphasizes that the colonial rule is the bringer of violence into the home and into the mind of the native. He even asserts that violence is the natural state of colonial rule. The violence derives from the racialized views that the colonizer has about colonized subjects. So it's basically saying if you establish power on the basis of violence, you normalize and naturalize violence, and you're almost cooking violence into the consciousness of the subject, of both the colonizer and the colonized. Violence becomes a sort of mode of being. So when you establish that, and this is something Fanon gets at, like, well, of course, if you started shit, there might be some shit. I wish we had a music license so we could end the stream today on that song. Henry, I know it's 11:01. Are you okay to rock for a few more minutes?
Yeah. I just also want to bring up Richard Slotkin. He did a lot of writing on the Western and American mythology, and regeneration of violence is kind of a phrase he coined. Worth looking into if you're a big fan of all of what we've been talking about today.
Yeah, like the stream if you haven't. We're close to 777. I'd like to end on a spiritual note today because I love spirituality. So in that same passage, Fanon goes on to say the colonizer often inscribes the colonized subject with ideas of backwardness and a lack of empathy and rationality. The colonial subject is therefore dehumanized by colonialism to such an extent that it turns him into an animal. Then it becomes natural for the colonizer to deploy violence in the colonial context because the dehumanized colonial subject will not respond to anything else. We won't read the whole thing. I posted a link to this one in the chat. I will post it once again in case anyone wants to read this whole piece on Fanon. I would say even if you're not like a person that reads philosophy stuff, I think this one's really understandable. Cesar's discourse on colonialism, also great. I'm sorry if I said his name incorrectly there. I often mispronounce names because I'm like a dumb smart person. I think that the internet and YouTube in particular has a lot of, how do I phrase this? Smart dumb people, but I'm a dumb smart person. If that doesn't make sense to you, I can explain later. But let me see. Let's just look at the last paragraph, actually, if you scroll down right before the reference to the writer of this, whose name is Josh Pallas, research assistant in politics and international studies at the Faculty of Law, Humanities and Arts at the University of Wollongong, New South Wales. Australia, what are you doing? If you want us to take you seriously, don't name places Wollongong. I kid. Frantz Fanon provides a useful account of both the positive and negative effects of colonial violence on individuals. Violence has the potential to be liberatory and cathartic in the sense that it allows a colonial subject to free themselves and recreate a positive new identity after a long time of enduring colonialism. Conversely, violence also has negative effects, physical and mental damage that violence does to individuals and their families. This violence becomes problematic when it becomes an end to itself, which does not have a political goal. And I think that's important as well. For Fanon, revolutionary political violence can only be effective if it has a built-in end to that violence. If it is trying to decolonize or free a group of people and create a liberatory situation, I think, and Fanon gets at this, a thing we do see in history are instances where in revolutionary violence, oh, thank you, Alex. I'm glad we can be dumb, smart people together. But the notion there would be that I'm not seeing 777 dead card 13, but I would love to see it. If someone has confirmation, let us know. But Fanon does note that often regimes established via violence or groups using violence to achieve a supposedly liberatory mean can kind of make the mistake of building that violence into their humanity, into their collective ethos and project, and that is a bad thing. But he's almost saying when you cook a cake, like when an ingredient of the cake is violence, there's going to be violence in that cake. Omnipotent Lenny said, would you say the Haitian Revolution had an effective end goal? I mean, I think so I'm like iffy on Haitian history, Omnipotent Lenny. It's something I was more serious about for a while. There's a really good book. It might be called Damning the Flood or something. It's written by Peter Hallward. Peterhallward. Really good book on Haiti. But, I think it's really hard to evaluate what happened in Haiti without really considering the ramifications of France literally holding them in debt of lost property for self-emancipating enslaved people. Because that's what happened. The Haitians self-emancipated, and France was like, cool, we'll let you be independent, but you owe us for all the lost property. Oh, what property? The guns? The food? No, you people, because you're property. You're our property. And we lost you. So, there you go. Dick Smith, we're glad that you are here. Let's see. I'm not going to watch live streams on Patreon anymore. I think, Cynthia, if you watch them on Patreon, it's still via YouTube, so it's all good. I will say that we have a Patreon. I will say you can check it out if you want to. I will say it's a great way to support the channel because, all the ad stuff, the clicks, it's all really crazy. As well, if you drink coffee, check out our coffee partner, Yes Please. They rip very hard. They're very good people. And you get great coffee from them. But if anyone else in the chat has thoughts on this, I think we're living through a weird historical moment. It feels weird that we have to every week now, every 2 streams or whatever. Oh, someone says the Revolutions podcast is a great season on Haiti. You have to try to make sense of what's happening. But I will just say that, pay attention to the language being used in discourses in America right now. Pay attention to the way that violence gets used, because it's being used in a very selective and manipulative way. And when we think about violence, I think this is where Arendt is important. We have to think about the relation. Dr. Clownick, because I think that counts as 8 people, and we appreciate it. When we think about violence in a political context, we have to think about its relationship to power, and we have to think about the times in which what we think of as power is actually just violence. And I think if we go back to what we talked about 40 minutes ago, very, very important distinction to hold on to. But yes, being canceled is violence. We're going to be back on Wednesday. Guys, we'll see what happens in the world between now and Wednesday. We want to know what you want us to talk about. So hit us up at wisecracklive666@gmail.com. I always go back and look at the comments for streams. So please leave comments here if you're watching later. Would love
now
to. Okay,
we're
so
at 779.
777, guys. We got there because we're spiritually on top of it. Thank you so much, guys, for getting us past 777. Can blessings be upon us? Someone asked me to riff on Thomas Jefferson did nothing on behalf of Haiti's revolution, man. Thomas Jefferson, tough hang. But I guess to editorialize a little bit at the end, I'm curious what you all think with this too. But what happened? It's not good. We don't want to live in a place where people are just out here on roofs trying to kill people. I don't care what side of the spectrum you're on. You don't want that. You might think you want that, or
Yeah.
it's funny or edgy. You don't want that.
There's
Um,
no follow up for if anything like that happens. It's disastrous, like regardless of where you are on the compass.
yeah, David Lego Hands really love the Modest Mouse thing, but we don't. It's almost like you don't want this smoke, um, but we don't. We don't want the smoke. We don't want people. We want snipers. We don't want assassins in our society. Shouts to American Sniper, really good guy. I know that Clint Eastwood only makes movies about American legends, but we don't want that. A guy that knows a little bit about it. I absolutely have more hair on my shoulders than my head. I have more hair on my chest than my head. I have more hair on my toes than I do on my head. I have hair everywhere but the top of my head. It's insane. But important to note that violence is very much embedded into our system, and political violence is something that's more insidious, it's more ingrained, it's more psychological, it's more cultural than acts of chaotic violence. And what we're going to see happen, if I were to be reckless and predict some things, we're going to see some calls and attempts at actual political violence that use the end of political violence to justify actual political violence. I think that's what we're going to see. I don't want to see that, guys. I don't want to see that. What I do want to see is the finale of the season of The Boys, and I'm afraid they're not going to air it. This shouldn't be a spoiler, but plug your ears for 5 seconds if you haven't watched The Boys and you want to know nothing. But the whole current season has led up to an attempt to assassinate a president, and that's supposed to air Wednesday. And I'm supposed to finish a video on it that we're going to air. So I don't know. I don't know if Daddy Jeff's going to let that happen. In the meantime, thank you so much for hanging out on a Monday, guys. It's a tough day. It's been a weird week. Thank you so much for creating the space for us to work this stuff out together, get through some stuff. Hopefully we learned a little bit. If you have other thinkers you like, other theories you're into, please email us at wisecracklive666 or drop links in comments. We would love to talk some more things. We didn't just talk about Arendt today and Fanon, because they're the only people that are interesting on this. They're just 2 people. We only have so much time. But thanks for getting us to 777. Thanks for hanging out. And let's just let's be humans. Let's just be humans. Okay. I'll catch you guys on Wednesday. See you.